do that little sanity check that I like to do just to see that it's working on the page. In my app.js, I will import my header. Let's put everything here in a div since I know that I'll have multiple things here. Okay, my header component is showing up. Next, let's get the content on the screen. I know it's not just an H1, so I think I'll surround this whole thing with a header element. And I probably wouldn't call this an H1 because it's not really the main headline of the page. It's sort of in the header itself. So let's maybe call it an H2. Before that, I'm going to have an image. I already know the source is going to be my image's troll face. And let's see, it needs to be relative like this. Can't really decide what it should be. Let's just call it maybe an H4 or something. We'll just say it's header. I'll hit save and go to my styles. Usually with two-dimensional layouts like this in a single line, I will revert to flexbox. So we'll say this is display flex. We'll align everything to the center. From the design, it looks like the height is maybe about 65 pixels. That's making my image overflow a bit. We'll fix the image in just a minute, but I'm going to grab my background, which is from the design, so I'm just going to paste it directly from the design there. The color of the fonts. Align everything to the center. From the design, it looks like the height is maybe about 65 pixels. That's making my image overflow a bit. We'll fix the image in just a minute, but I'm going to grab my background, which is from the design, so I'm just going to paste it directly from the design there. The color of the fonts and the text should be white. And there probably should be a bit of padding. I think we have something like 15 on the top and bottom and 20 on the left and right, although it might just be 20 all around. We'll just call it 20 all around. Then I will give some class names to the other elements here. We have header image, header title, and header project. So we'll start with the image. And we'll make sure that this fits within the boundaries of its parent by saying you have a max height of 100%. In the design, it looks like there's also some space about 6 pixels. So I'll give this margin right of 6 pixels. The header title has a font size of about 20 pixels. And I can push my React course project 3 all the way to the right by giving my title a margin right of auto. We can see that a little more readily if I make this wider. Oh, and this still says header component. Let's update that to say meme generator. And let's lastly style our project text. That has a fairly small font size. We'll say that's about 12 pixels. I think the weight is maybe different. Let's give it a font weight 500. And yeah, that does change it, so we'll leave that on there. And you know what? One thing I'm trying to get better at is using rems for my font size instead. 20 pixels over 16 pixels equates to about 1.25 rem. And to get better at is using rems for my font size instead. 20 pixels over 16 pixels equates to about 1.25 rem. And 12 pixels over 16 is about 0.75 rem. Well, it's exactly 0.75 rem. Awesome work. This is a great start. The next thing we can do is attack this form here. We've got 2 inputs and a button. We're not quite ready to make them functional, but we can at least get them on the page. So let's do that in the next challenge. The next piece of our project that we can bite off is the form that we have right here with the 2 inputs and the button. So that's your challenge for this screencast. Don't worry at all about creating any functionality for it. I've outlined exactly the steps that I want you to do here. We're going to create a component called meme. Inside that meme component, we'll render a styled form, which will have our 2 inputs and our button. Pause the screencast and work on this challenge. Let's actually, since I'm artist this time, I'm going to pretend that I already have a meme component created. So I'll just import it and render it since I'm already here in this file. And then I'll actually create it. So inside of components, I'll create meme.js and set up my component. Now, I didn't talk about this specifically, but I happen to know ahead of time that I'm going to put both my form and the actual meme image and this text all into the same component. The reason I want to do that has to do with when we start talking about state and where state needs to live. So in an effort to reduce complexity, I'm just going to put everything in the one component. The reason I mention that is because I already know ahead of time that I'm going to use a main element to surround everything else on my app. If you didn't do that, it's completely okay, but this inside of here is where I'm going to put my form. I already know that my form has 2 inputs and a button. I've already got my button text copied and I'll paste it here since it's got the little emoji there. I also know that I want these to be a type of text. So I'll add the type text there. Let's hit save, see what we're working with. Okay, pretty generic styling. Let's give this some love in the CSS. I think the way that I would like to lay this out is using grid. I could probably use flexbox as well, but what I'll do is make a 2-column and 2-row grid and lay the elements out there inside. The grid will be the form, so I'll make that the grid container. I'll give this a class name, the form. While I'm here, I think I'll give these their own class names as well. I'm going to put these on their own lines. We'll say these are form inputs, and I'll give my button a class name, form button. I guess I can also give my inputs some placeholder text, so we'll add top text and bottom text. It's a little more helpful. Now in our CSS, let's select our form, change it to display grid, and then set up a grid template that has 2 40-pixel rows, and then evenly divide the columns with fraction units. So we'll have 2 columns, 1 bar each. Since I have 3 items, and then evenly divide the columns with fraction units. So we'll have 2 columns, 1 FR each. Since I have 3 items, it's putting the first item filling up 1 column, the next item filling up the next column, and then the third. So instead of a grid template that has 2 40-pixel rows, and then evenly divide the columns with fraction units. So we'll have 2 columns, 1 FR each. Since I have 3 items, it's putting the first item filling up 1 column, the next item filling up the next column, and then the third item only filling up 1 column. The inputs look essentially the way that I want them to, but I want the button to span the whole thing. So I'll select my form button and tell it that its grid column will go from the very beginning to the very end. Awesome. It looks like in the design there's a little bit of a gap. I can use the gap property to spread things out a little bit. And of course, everything is butting up against the edges of my page here. I only am going to have one main element, so I'm just going to select the main element directly. And let's give it a padding, I think, of about 36 pixels is what the design shows. One thing you might notice is that the placeholder text and the button text are not taking on our Carla font family. For whatever reason, inputs and buttons inside forms tend not to do that. So I will specifically add that in my form button, and I will also select my form inputs inside forms tend not to do that. So I will, the button text are not taking on our Carla font family. For whatever reason, inputs and buttons inside forms tend not to do that. So I will specifically add that in my form button, and I will also select my form inputs. I think I'll put this above my form button since my inputs are above my button markup. And I'll give that the font family as well. Let's also get some border radiuses here. I've got both of these as having a border radius of 5 pixels. The inputs have a border of 1 pixel solid and then this color that I'm copying from the design. And we need our hash mark there. There's a fun property called text indent that I learned about here. I can make it so that my placeholder text and my actual input text will bump in a little bit or have a little bit of an indent. Just give it a 5 pixel indent. And I just noticed that these styles are not applying. That's because I need this to say form inputs, not form inputs. Okay, that's working now. We comment this out. Yeah, you can see what the text indent is doing. That's because I need this to bump hash mark there. There's a fun property called text indent that I learned about here. I can make it so that my placeholder text and my actual input text will bump in a little bit or have a little bit of an indent. Just give it a 5 pixel indent. And I just noticed that these styles are not applying. That's because I need this to say form inputs, not form inputs. Okay, give it a 5 pixel indent. And I just noticed that these styles are not applying. That's because I need this to say form inputs, not form input. To span the whole thing, so I'll select my form button and tell it that its grid column will go from the very beginning to the very end. Awesome. It looks like in the design there's and tell it that its grid column will go from the very beginning to the very end. Awesome. It looks like in the design there's a little bit of a gap. I can use the gap property to spread things out a little bit. And of course, everything is butting up against the edges of my page here. I only am going to have one main element. So this is that the placeholder, I will specifically add that in my form button, and I will also select my form inputs. So get order of 1 pixel solid and hash mark there, a little bit of an indent. Okay, that's working. And the Figma file that also gives a cursor of pointer. Okay, my button needs a lot of help. I'm going to take the background from the design in the Figma file that also gives us that gradient of purple. I need to change the color to white. I'm going to remove the border. I always like my buttons to have a cursor of pointer. I need to change the color to white. I'm going to remove the border. I always like my buttons to have a cursor of pointer. And awesome, that's looking great. It looks very much like our design. Now, at this point, I probably could separately create this image with the text sitting on top, but I think it's high time that we jump into actually great. It looks very much like our design. Now, at this point, I probably could separately create this image with the text sitting on top, but I think it's high time that we jump into actually understanding what it is we need to learn in order to do the functional parts of this application, including clicking the button and typing in our text. So in the next class, we'll talk about what that will actually take. The primary thing that sets apart a static website like we've been building so far with web applications is the ability for the user to actually interact with our page. And in order for a user to interact with our page, we have to be listening for different events on that page and then reacting when those events happen. Let's get a quick overview as to how this app will work. As soon as the app loads for the very first time, it's immediately going to make a call to an API called ImageFlip, which will return to us an array of 100 meme images that are the most popular at that time. Then, clicking the Get a New Meme Image button will simply randomly choose one of those 100 images in the array that got returned to us. And as you've probably figured out, typing into the left input box will give us our top text, and typing into the right input box will give us our bottom text. Now, there's a lot of it that we need to break down before it becomes overwhelming. So let's start off really easy. The first thing we'll do is learn how to add an event listener to our button so that we can run some kind of logic when the button is clicked. And we'll start that in the next lesson. The primary thing that separates a static website from a web application is the ability for the user to interact with what they see on the screen. By now, you should have built plenty of JavaScript applications that use events and event listeners to allow the user to interact with your application. So this application really new to you. You should already be familiar probably with two different ways that in a vanilla JavaScript application you can add events to your program. First of all, there's the .add event listener, which you probably are already familiar with. If you were adding a click event, you would then provide a function, and inside the function, you put the code of whatever should happen when the element that you're listening for an event gets clicked. Alternatively, there's a way in HTML where you would essentially put on click and set that equal to the name of the function followed by parentheses. This second way is going to be much more similar to how we actually accomplish adding event listeners to items in React. For example, let's start with a button here. We're going to make it so that when we click the button, something will log. Much more similar to it, essentially put on click and set it in the element that you're listening for an event gets clicked. Alternatively, there's a way in HTML where you would essentially put on click and set that equal to the name of the function followed by parentheses. This second way is going to be much more similar to how we actually accomplish adding event listeners to items in React. For example, let's start with a button here. We're going to make it so that when we click the button, something will log to the console. In React, all I need to do is on my button add an on click, and you'll notice that I use a capital C. And that's because we are accessing the DOM properties of the object that's being created here. As a reminder, what React is doing is it's taking this JSX element that it sees, which in the end returns a plain JavaScript object describing the DOM element that should be created by React, and whatever properties or attributes we add here inside the JSX are directly accessing the equivalent properties in JavaScript. If I were to select this button in JavaScript using document.getElementById or something like that, I would have a DOM element that has a property called onClick with a capital C. And this camel casing is the standard throughout all of our JavaScript elements. So all that means is that instead of using the lowercase c like you might be used to doing in HTML, we're going to have camel cased properties everywhere. So on click, maybe on mouse over, or on mouse enter, and so forth. Let me put this back to on click and we'll see the other difference here. Now instead of setting this equal to a string, which has a function name, because I'm here in JavaScript, I can actually just use a set of curly braces and then put a function directly here inside of my onClick. Now personally, I'm not a big fan of stuffing my functions inside of my markup here if I can avoid it. So what I usually do is above my return, but still inside my component, I'll define another function up here and say handle click maybe, because this is the click event handler. Then I can say console log I was clicked. Let me get rid of this, and I'm going to give you a mini challenge. Okay, pause the screencast and make it so that clicking the button will run our handle click function. You're thinking that you can put handle click with a set of parentheses, and well, let me refresh and see what happens. Notice that as soon as I ran this code, it ran my handle click function. I don't want this set of parentheses here because that will run this function as soon as the program reads this line of code. Instead, I'm passing the function as a value so that React can add that function as the event handler in case a click ever happens on this button. So without the parentheses there, I can hit refresh, clean this up, and hit click me, and then that's when our click event handler runs. The React documentation has a full list of all of the events that it supports. I've included here a screenshot that you can click from the React documentation. This will take you specifically to the mouse events. I personally found that mouse events probably make up a good 95% of the events that I listen for in any program I write, and you'll probably need to use this as a guide for the challenge that we will do right now. Your challenge is to log something to the console whenever the mouse hovers over the image. I added some CSS to darken the image just so it was a little more obvious when the mouse was actually hovering over the image. Again, feel free to use this as your reference, pause the screencast, and work on this challenge. We have on mouse enter, which will run anytime the mouse enters an item that we're listening for an event on. And there's also on mouse over, which essentially does the same thing. It just has a slight difference dealing with children elements. Right now, we don't have any children elements of our image, so it really wouldn't matter which one we use. First, let me create a function that will run when I can simply add to my image. So after the source, we'll say on mouse over, hit save. And now when I hover over the indentation, event listeners already should be a little bit familiar with events that you may not have listeners at this point. Fortunately, doing it in React is actually fairly straightforward. And now this sets us up for one of the coolest parts of React, and we're going to jump into that next. Let's apply what we just learned about event listeners to our meme generator project. Ultimately, what we'll be doing is making an API call as soon as our component loads and getting data from an API that includes 100 of the most popular meme images right now. But we haven't quite yet learned everything we need in order to make that work. So for now, what I've done is I made the API request and I just saved the data that came back here in memesdata.js. You can see we have the object. It's got a data property that has a memes property, and that is an array of 100 items. Each one of those items is an object that has a URL property. So you're going to have to do a little bit of digging into this memes data object, but your challenge is to make it so that when we click the button, it will randomly choose one of those URLs and just log it to the console. For now, don't worry about displaying the image yet. One modification I made to our markup here is I changed our form element into a div element. Randomly choose one of those URLs and just log it to the console. For now, don't worry about displaying the image yet. But your challenge is to make it so that when we click the button, it will randomly choose one of those URLs and just log it to the console. For now, don't worry about displaying the image yet. One modification I made to our markup here is I changed our form element into a div element. Long story short, when you have a button inside of a form, it actually submits that form and tends to refresh the page unless you use our form element. Will randomly choose one of those URLs and just log it to the console. For now, don't worry about displaying the image yet. One modification I made to our markup here is I changed anthems is an object that has a URL property. So you're going to have to do a little bit of digging into this memes data object, but your challenge is to make it so that when we click the button, our form element into a div element and just log it to the console. For now, don't worry about displaying the image yet. One modification I made to our markup here is I changed our form element into a div element. Long story short, when you have a button inside of a form, it actually submits that form and tends to refresh the page unless you stop it. But I realized that there's actually no reason for this to be collected together in a form because ultimately this button does its own thing by getting a new image. It does not take these inputs and submit them somewhere. So in this case, I feel like it's okay to have our inputs floating outside of a form, and that way it means that when we click our button, it doesn't refresh our page because it's not trying to submit a form. Okay, so the challenge is to get a random image from the memes data array, which I've already imported for you. You'll get that anytime this new meme image button is clicked. For now, just log the URL of that new image to the console. If you're feeling hazy on how to get a random item from an array, you'll probably want to turn to Google, but I know that you'll be able to do it. Pause the screencast, work on this challenge. Let's start by hooking up our button. I'm going to add an onClick event listener. When the button is clicked, I will run that. There's the object is hooked up correctly. Save, click that, created that, so let's create that function, get meme image, add memes, and that's my array. The data times the length of my array, so that's memes array length. This random number should get me a random index of my memes array times the length of my array, so that's with a URL property. So let's actually just console log random number and see how we're doing so far. 16, 50, 92. Okay, I wanted to see a high number to make sure that it was going up to 100. I probably don't need to click this until I see 100, or actually I think it would be 99. So I can get my image object, or actually I can just do it all in one. I'll say const URL equals, and then I'll index into memes array at the index of random number. This is my object with a URL property. So I'll just save that as URL so it's nice and short. Or if we wanted to do some object destructuring, I could just say, get me the URL property from this memes array. I don't want to conflate a few things here, so I'll just keep it straightforward like this. And the object destructuring, I could just say, get me the URL property from this memes array. I don't want to conflate a few things here, so I'll just keep it straightforward like this. And then we'll just console log URL. Of course, I could do probably most of this in a single line, but I find that sometimes separating it out makes it a lot easier for other people to read. Let's save, and I guess I have no way to ensure that these are in the correct index, but I can't see why they wouldn't be. So this is awesome. We're getting random images every time we click our button. At this point, we are a little bit blocked, and I'll show you why. If I create, let's say, a paragraph down here, and I try to stick my URL in there, well, first of all, I have a problem because my URL is only declared inside of this function. And so this is not going to know what I'm talking about. If I hit refresh, it's going to say it doesn't know what URL is, essentially. So you might think, well, let's declare URL outside of the function. You could say let URL, and then just set URL equal to this, console log URL. You hit save, and now at least URL is, well, of course, my styling's all messed up because I can just set URL equal to this, console log URL. You hit save, and now at least URL is, well, of course, my styling's all messed up because my paragraph is, let's put this set URL, well, of course, my styling's all messed up because my paragraph is, let's put this text site here, so we have it above. Click new meme image. Okay, well, we set URL equal to the new meme image right here. However, my UI did not update. This has everything to do with the way that React looks at variables and decides when it should update the UI or the user interface. And spoiler alert, it doesn't do that by just looking at every variable that we declare inside of our component. Okay, and now at least URL function. It's a let URL, and then just set URL equal to this, console log URL. You hit save, and now at least URL is, well, of course, my styling's all messed up because my paragraph is, let's put this text site here, so we have it above. Click new meme image. Okay, well, we set URL equal to the new meme image right here. However, my UI did not update. This has everything to do with the way that React looks at variables and decides when it should update the UI or the user interface. And spoiler alert, it doesn't do that by just looking at every variable that we declare inside of our component. In the next task, we're going to dive a little deeper into this conundrum that we have and start figuring out how we can make it so that we can update a variable that will then replace what we have on screen with the new value of that variable. At this point in our journey, we have mostly been dealing with static websites. In the previous section, we showed how we can take data that we pull from, for example, an API. We were just using a little JavaScript local data file to mimic pulling from an API, and then we mapped over that array of data to display items on the screen. However, in order to interact with those items on the screen, we are still missing something. I want to demonstrate what I mean, but before we do that, just in case it's been a little while, let's get our hands on the keyboard with a quick challenge. I have here just a locally defined array with two strings in it, thing1 and thing2. I want you to map over the things array, generate a paragraph element for every item in the array, and then render those items below the button right here. This challenge harkens back to the last section where we learned about .map and how to take an array of data and turn it into elements on the page. So pause the screencast and work on this challenge. And I will set it is the text of that thing inside my curly. Everyone, this is great, but we've got this button that doesn't currently do anything. Let me set up another quick challenge for you. The concept is going to be that you click the add item button and it adds another thing to our things array, namely thing 3, and then you click it again, it'll be thing 4, and so forth. I'll type up this challenge now. Okay, your challenge is to add an event listener to our button so that when it gets clicked in this array, and the page is not worth changing on the page. But let's create things array and set up the static array that we have there. So I probably could add the whole thing in one step just to be, we can use a template, and then I can say things array.push space, and then insert a new thing text. And that's going to be, we can use a template literal, so I can say thing space, and then insert some JavaScript where I say things array.length +1. And then I can say things also I can say thing space, and then insert some JavaScript where I say things array.length +1. And then I can say things array.push new thing text. And then of course I'm going to log the things array after I push the new item. Let me open the console so we can See that a little more clearly. I'll hit save, add item. Okay, oh, not a number, of course, because it's public row. Let's try that again. Add item, thing 3, thing 4, thing 5. Great, well, our array is changing, but of course what we see on the screen is not. And this brings us to our conundrum. At this point, React is not looking at local arrays that are just saved within a component to determine whether or not something should get re-rendered, or rather if the return here should run again with an updated value for things elements. Actually, maybe more specifically, I'm determining my things elements way up here at the top, back when things array is just 2 items long, and then it's sort of cementing this things elements into its memory, and no matter what I do to change things array, it's not going to automatically change things elements. In my early days, I thought maybe if I put this below add item or something like that, it might make a difference, but that's not going to change the fact that this line of code will only run one time, and that's the very first time the app component gets rendered right here. We need to clean this up real quick. Now, one thing that might be tempting to do is inside of our add item function to say, well, let's not just update our array, let's actually select the elements to that list. And this is one of the major benefits of having a declarative library like React. It makes it so that all we really need to do is update our data, and React will automatically, react to that change and update our UI to display what has changed in the data. All we need to be in charge of is making sure that the data updates correctly, and React will handle the rest. However, for that to work, we need to access something called React State. And state will allow us to sort of hook into the component and make it so that whenever we update our state, which is really just values that we're saving inside of this component, it makes it so React will update the user interface based on any changes that happen to those values that are being saved in state. And truthfully, if you think of pretty much any website that you interact with, if it were made in React, any kind of interaction you had would change the state. The first thing that comes to mind is maybe, I don't know, a playlist or a recipe where you hit a little heart icon or maybe a bookmark icon and it fills it in and likely sends a message out to a database that updates the fact that you have liked a recipe or a song. Or maybe it's an accordion or a carousel where you click something and an image shifts over or a portion of the page expands so you can read more information. Any of those interactions in React are going to be updating state, which then makes it so that React can update the user interface to respond to however you interact with the page. So now let me update this using state and you can see how it will actually start to work again the way we originally expected. Obviously at this point some of this will look a little bit foreign and that's totally okay. We're going to dive deep into understanding how to actually write this ourselves, but you can see that not that much changed in my actual code, but suddenly I have an app that's working the way that I expected. The example is a little bit contrived obviously, but hopefully you can see the exciting world of state in React that we're approaching and start to imagine some of the cool things that it's going to allow us to do. So buckle up and get ready to jump into React State. One thing I've learned over my years of teaching React is that one of the major points of confusion for students when they're first learning React is understanding the difference between props, which you have already learned, and state, which we are about to learn. So let's take some time and clarify the differences between the two and when you would want to use one over the other. And first thing we'll do is look at props. We've seen how we can implement props in practice, but let's take a second to actually talk about them. When we refer to props, we are referring to the properties that we are passing into a component in order for that component to work correctly. This is similar to how a function can receive parameters, quote unquote, from above. Just like a function that receives parameters, a component that receives props is not allowed to modify those props, or in other words, those props are called immutable. Let's first take a look at a regular function. Let's say I define a function, assume that this function was some kind of error that says function, and I can assume two numbers. I'll provide is that inside the body of this function instead of equal to 42. Technically, this probably works if I were to console log the result for it to be something different. Similarly, in React, I would never want equal to something else. This never changed manually. Or maybe more to set props.anything or props itself equal to anything different, because incoming props should be immutable and they should never change manually. Or maybe more specifically, those props should never change from within the body of our component itself. Now, that's not to say that when I have an instance of my navbar that I can't provide a cover image that changes. Let's say it starts out as some image 1, and then, I don't know, maybe there's a button on the screen. When the user clicks that button, I want my navbar's cover image to update to some other image. Maybe this is a little convoluted because I'm not really using images here. But the instance of my navbar that I can't provide a cover image that changes. Let's say it starts out as some image 1, and then, I don't know, maybe there's a button on the screen. When the user clicks that button, I want my navbar's cover image to update to some other image. Maybe this is a little convoluted because I'm not really using images here. But the point is, I can change the values that I pass to my component. That's fine. That's something I'm allowed to do, and as we jump into state, we're going to see why that's even useful. But from within the body of the function, I should never ever change my props. In the same way that I would never want to change the parameters being passed to my function. Another way to think about props here, we read that they are the properties being passed into a component in order for it to work correctly. If it helps, you could think of it as the properties being passed to a component in order to and do more than just take in the data that should just be displayed as a part of the component. Sometimes they will receive configuration objects or properties. Let's say, for example, off the top of my head, if we had a component that we wanted to display either in light mode or dark mode, well, then maybe I would have a dark mode property, anything like that. But instead, this is a property that is configuring my navbar in order for it to act and display correctly. Okay, I might be beating a dead horse here, so let's move on, and we're going to see how. If props are data that a component is receiving from above and shouldn't be changing, state, on the other hand, are values that are defined within a component and essentially should be changing. So as we see here, state refers to any values that are managed by the component itself, kind of like a function that declares its own variables from within that function. Long story short, anytime your component has changing values that should be saved and displayed, you're most likely going to be using state. We'll jump into what this looks like in React in a second, but I think it might be helpful to see how this compares in a vanilla JavaScript example, kind of like we did with our add2numbers and having what we can equate to props being passed in as these parameters, and how we shouldn't be changing them from within the definition of this function itself. In order to create an equivalent in vanilla JavaScript of our concept of state, let me write out a challenge for you. Let's say we have a function called greeting. It takes a name as a parameter, and what it should return is a string like good afternoon and then followed by the name. Of course, afternoon will change depending on the current time of day, as you can read from the challenge description up there. At this point, this is more of a vanilla JavaScript algorithm challenge for you, but I think it's good to incorporate those into our React course here. And maybe just so that I'm not making you chase Google a whole bunch right now, I'm going to give you a couple hints here. So you can get the current time of day by following these two lines of code. Essentially, first you create a new date object in JavaScript, and then clear. I have included my one at 3:59 a.m., but whatever. My point is, you won't need to get the minutes here. You can just use the hours like I've shown you here. Also screencast, see if you can complete this challenge, and then we're going to bring the concepts back into understanding state in React. Just put in a solution here, answer should say 12 there. Yep. So I will type out some logic that I think will just kind of intuitively make sense. The first thing I'll do is just declare a changeable value here, time of day, and then depending on the current number of hours, I will change the string time of day to be either morning, afternoon, evening, or night, just like I talked about in the challenge. And now that I have a time of day value, I can simply return the string, and I'll use some interpolation here. We'll say good, then we'll stick in the time of day, comma, and then I'll use the value for name that I'm receiving as the parameter to greeting, exclamation point, and let's go ahead and see if this works. Again, it's about 12 o'clock my time, so I should, I'll need to console log this, the value that gets returned. Good afternoon, Bob. Okay, now the point here is my function is receiving a parameter. This parameter is not something that I will want to change in the way of saying name equals something different, because that would just be, a kind of a strange thing to do when you are expecting the outside user of this function to provide you the name. Similarly, in React, we are not going to take any props and then just change them, which is what we talked about in the last screencast. However, there are definitely reasons for us to, within our own function, create values that we can either use or even change, like our let time of day here. In React, values that are created by the function or the component itself are usually handled with state. Okay, I think that's more than enough of the conceptual difference between props and state. At this point, it's probably best for us to just get our hands dirty and start actually seeing how we can implement state in React. And then as we build our section project, we will get much better exposure into how state and props will work together and how they are different from each other as well. It's time for another quiz. This one's going to specifically be looking at the difference between props and state. So as always, read through these questions, click in the United Thought has the concept in a component, but there are a few added bonuses to it, which we're going to get to later. So when would you use props instead of state in React? I think the easiest way to think about this is to compare it to regular JavaScript. On React, you would so to speak, configure the component so that the component can use it to determine how something gets displayed. Okay, so when would you want to use state and you use the values? As we mentioned earlier, so you would use state anytime you want a component to maintain some values from within that component, and by the way, also remember those values even when React needs to re-render the component. Again, we're going to see that much more in detail a little bit later. And the reason I bring this up, the entire purpose of renders into a function built on changing state. Okay, we saw in an earlier lesson how it's not going for a component if whenever we did that, there's state inside a state right now directly, and we'll usually see it happen. However, just for perfect clarity and for it to be very clear that it's coming from calling React value and its second value, well, in scrimba it says f parentheses, that's the string hello. To a string yes, just the string hello. 0, script, which is not important to know. Okay, well, there's a couple of problems we have. First, actually updates. So hello to mark this now. The string yes. So I could replace this yes with a set of curly braces or to change this back to yes, because it certainly is important to know. Okay, well, there's a couple of problems we have. First of all, this is kind of funky to say result at the index of 0. In the next screencast, we're going to learn a little bit more about what we can do with this array. Really much smoother way to deal with this. And this requires us to use array destruct, and then we have to use the property name of same thing whatever we want. Instead, let's say maybe order to. Let's take a look and I said something like let. However, when we're working with state, we can't use a more meaningful name. Those changes accordingly. It's something different. Instead, we are given a function that allows us to make fully what we call our states. In fact, I'm not even certain that it would work. Instead, we would normally want to set or change the state whenever something specific happens on the page. So let function run this line of code, and then to set up an event listener on this. Click here. Awesome. Okay, notice that as soon as I clicked, it changed from yes to no. What happened is we took the function that we were given when we called React.useState. This function's job is to give us the ability to change the event. I click it. Let's take a look now at the function that we. All right, here we have something that's a little more dynamic. The idea is we will create a little counter. When I get plus, this number should go up. When I get minus, this number should go down. To start us off and to get your hands on the keyboard, I'm going to have you complete this challenge where you're going to set up state to try.